Well, thank you guys very much for coming. My name is Shannon Dahlstrom. I'm a parent in Chelmsford, just a few towns over. I'm a CPA, but I'm sort of a parent activist, if you will. Over the last few years, gotten very involved as my oldest is only in second grade, so I'm very involved in what's going on in school, and have become very active in Common Core and our ballot question and Common Core Mass. And so a lot of times I'll help put on things like this when Dr. Stotsky's available or someone else to sort of talk about, especially from a parent's perspective, you know, what's going on in different schools. Sometimes it's different, and what was great about having Sandra here is that she's in such a great position to be able to compare and contrast the differences in our standards now. She was critical, being the deputy commissioner, I believe, is that right, at the time, when we first developed the original standards, the Mass frameworks, and was, you know, really critical in that role of lots of public input, years and drafts, and to work on those to make them. And they have always been considered the #1 standards in the country. She was also able to sit on the Common Core Validation Committee. So there were 29 members at the end of the whole Common Core drafting process. These are the members that were asked to validate and say at the end of it that we sign off that these are considered. I think there were 7 criteria.
There were a number of criteria: research-based, internationally benchmarked, rigorous were the top 3.
Yeah, and Sandra and 4 other individuals refused and said that these are not meeting those criteria. I remember talking with you, and even reading from Dr. Milgram.
Jim Milgram at Stanford was the mathematician. I was the ELA specialist.
The work that you guys put into with all of your questions and feedback working through that committee, and never really getting responses and you know, real feedback of why. Okay, we're asking a question, why would we do this, not this? No real responses. So what's been very helpful for me in doing these types of things and being able to talk with Sandra is to, as I learn more and more, I've been able to sort of say, well, all right, I'm a little confused about something. I see this, so why doesn't that work in these? And being in that position to truly compare, where other people maybe just know Common Core or just know the original frameworks and haven't seen much of, you know, haven't paid attention to the changes. So, you know, so today Sandra will talk through some of those differences between the standards. If at any point you just have a question or just want to clarify it, you know, please just, you know, speak up. And then maybe after sort of that background, I'll just talk a little bit more about the ballot question for everybody's, you know, to understand what that question would do, depending on which way it goes, and any, you know, background to it and that sort of thing. So,
okay, fine. Then that was going to be the first part of my talk, because I wasn't sure what you were going to say about the purpose of the ballot question. And I've listed the 2 basic purposes on this outline, which I created. So you can see that, 1, we want to rescind the Board of It. I was on the State Board of Education at the time, and I do know, this happens to be important, and I'll explain later why. On July 21st, 2010, there was a vote to adopt Common Core standards in math and ELA. And that was the main vote in July 2010 to adopt them. And the purpose of the ballot question is to rescind the board's vote, because it has to be rescinded by a vote legally, because the Board of Ed won't do it on its own. And Part B is to restore the pre-Common Core standards in ELA and math that we had, which I know very well because I was in charge of them when I was in the department from 1999 to 2003. I was Senior Associate Commissioner, and among my many responsibilities, I was in charge of all of our K-12 standards. So I knew how good our standards were, and that is why, by the way, I was on Common Core's validation committee, because I already had a track record in understanding standards, particularly ELA standards, and Massachusetts kids had soared to the top in every way, and all demographic groups had also moved ahead, because that was a part of the philosophy, which I will mention a little bit more later on when I get to part 2, but you have to understand that that philosophy was key, as far as I'm concerned, to why Massachusetts kids did so well in the years from 2005 basically to this past year, because they haven't stopped. They're still at the top on all national NAEP tests, National Assessment of Educational Progress, so-called National Report Card, and on TIMS, which is the international test, Trends in International Math and Science Survey, and we tied for first place with Singapore in science in grade 8 in 2007 and in 2011. So that was a huge accomplishment that we had in science in grade 8 tied for first place with the leading country in the world, and in math we were among the top 6 countries, both in grade 4 and grade 8 on TIMS. It only tests certain grades, 4 and 8. It doesn't test every single grade level. But the average means that all kids were doing better. That's what an average usually comes from. So here we had standards that had a proven track record, and yet because of political deals and Gates Foundation money behind Common Core, our old standards were thrown out and Common Core standards were brought in, and as so far as we can see, kids are doing worse. They're going downhill. They're not going up now. This is national trends. I'm not talking about your individual classrooms or schools, because that isn't what is being picked up by NAEP tests, but the latest NAEP tests have shown a decline in grade 4 reading in Massachusetts, nationally a decline in grade 8, all of which means that the average is going down. But in Massachusetts, we were going the other direction. We're sort of plateauing at this point, and I can just tell you a little bit why I think we've stayed so long at the top, because we've stayed at the top since we hit it in '05. On NAEP tests, we hit the top in grade 4 and grade 8 in both reading and math. NAEP gets all states participating. It has to by law. And we did, I told you that well in science on the only international test of the science curriculum and the math curriculum. It's the only international test of the curriculum itself. So our kids were doing extremely well on tests that we couldn't manipulate in any way because they are outside of us. One that's international, we have nothing to do with however it's shaped or cut off or handled. Now, let me go into part 2 with some details, and then you can ask some questions based upon your own experience or whatever's come up in any school meetings or other meetings that you've attended. How do Common Core's ELA standards differ from pre-Common Core ELA standards? And I am confining myself mostly to ELA because I'm not a mathematician or a scientist. Professor Milgram, who was on the validation committee with me and who has a PhD in mathematics, he teaches, has taught for 40 years at Stanford University. He and I agreed that there were a lot of problems, but I always defer content questions to him. I don't pretend to answer content questions in math or science. I know the issues, but the actual content questions I defer to him because mathematicians are in some way like prima donnas. It's their area, and they don't want non-mathematicians mucking around with what they know. Doesn't matter what grade level it is. If you're not a mathematician, then you shouldn't be answering the question. And, you know, they don't think much, obviously, of anyone who comes from an ed school, because they're talking about real mathematics as far as they're concerned. So I steer away from any content questions in math. First, as you can see, one of the major differences, there are many minor differences, that Common Core's ELA standards focus to a large extent on reading comprehension exercises. And I say that because one of the standards writers, David Coleman, insisted that wasn't a ship's chime, that was to come from a ship. There's no ship here. That's a regular grandfather clock. In any event, informational reading was mandated by someone who has never taught at all in the schools and doesn't know anything about the teaching of literature or English or reading. And that was true, by the way, of Sue Pimentel, also one of the ELA standards writers for Common Core. That's why I was trying to ask them a lot of questions when I was on the validation committee and didn't get very far because they didn't want to talk to me. In any event, what has happened from what I can see, and I welcome your input on this, because there are no surveys of any kind by any organization, systematic information on what are reading or English teachers teaching as informational text. Literature is a separate issue. That was to be about 50% of the ELA curriculum, but informational reading was to be about 50% of the ELA curriculum, and might be even more in high school because superintendents have misunderstood what David Coleman wrote to begin with, and they think it might be 70%. In any event, this has happened in many states. It's been a total disaster, but David Coleman and Sue Pimentel will not straighten out their murky prose in the Common Core standards document. So superintendents all over the country have inferred that 70% of what English teachers in high school are to teach must be informational reading. Now, that destroys...
They're giving us, what can you just provide perspective?
Well,
What's an example?
That's the problem. They're giving snippets, excerpts, what I would call reading comprehension exercises. They're covering science. I don't have them here, but in some of the articles I've listed, it could be on what's in the latest zoo, what animal was just bought by your local zoo. I mean, it could be anything that is, quotes, informational, as opposed to literary by, you know, Melville, Hawthorne, or whatever. And the problem is that they're usually short pieces, which is why I call them reading comprehension exercises. They're typically not long. I have looked at all of the practice test items at Park and Smarter Balance, the two Common Core-based testing companies, have made available last year for anyone to look at, and they were all short selections or excerpts. They're not always excerpts. Sometimes they will just take a whole article that might have appeared in a museum journal or in an AP article, and they will reduce it or adapt it or revise it, make it suitable in their judgment for 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever. But these are short pieces, and the focus is on skills, because that's what Common Core's ELA standards focus on, skills. A skill is something like find the main idea, and if you have anything to do with teaching ELA, you're a math teacher, so you wouldn't, but the others may have looked at the ELA. It will ask what are the supporting details, where's your evidence, those are skills because they're not attached to any grade level. You have to understand what makes a skill and not a standard. A standard is when you say, use a text from Homer's Greece, classical Greece, epic poem, and then do something with its theme or characters or plot. Now, why is it a standard? Because it narrows and expects the teacher to teach, in this case, if it says an epic poem from classical Greece, it's going, if it's in 9th or 10th grade, to any English teacher, it will mean the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, if it says Greece or Rome. So it has a built-in range of reading levels. I can't say that all of them are high school reading level, but they all are, so far as I know, from what I've seen of their readability levels. But it also gives you some cultural period, some literary period to choose the work from that English teachers are familiar with, because most of them, not all of them, who were trained years ago have read one of these works, if not all of them. And that becomes a standard because you would not teach it in grade 4. You would not give the entire Odyssey or the Iliad in grade 4. To very able readers, you might give it in grade 7 or 8. There are private schools that have taught these works earlier. Some of you may know of them. But it has been common in grade 9 or 10 to have the Iliad or the Odyssey taught, particularly the Odyssey, because the word itself has become so resonant in terms of what we understand by an Odyssey. And it's part of what we call the basis for Western literature, because it doesn't matter what European country you talk about, the Odyssey, the wanderings of certain characters, were what formed Spanish literature, German literature, British literature. I mean, a lot of different literary traditions go back to classical Greece, and these first works that were finally written down and that we know about in terms of the influence of classical Greek thought and their works. Later it could be expanded to a tragedy or comedy that came out of classical Greece, which would then get you into Euripides, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes and all of what they accomplished that have influenced later playwrights, movies, other things. I mean, these are works that have had, over the centuries, remarkable influences culturally. And so that is when something becomes a standard, when it guides you to some particular period and some basic reading level range. And by the time you're in high school, you would expect kids to be reading high school level material. Sounds sort of common sense, but it's flown out of the window. Common Core, according to much of what is on the tests, does not have the expectation that kids are going to be reading stuff at the high school level of reading when they are in high school. So that raises the question, how do you prepare them for college if they're not reading at a grade 9-point to 12-point level? Because, and I've written an article which is going to be published in a journal in a few months about this, reading level of college textbooks is 13-point something. I mean, usually if you get a good readability formula, it will be somewhat calibrated to the grade level. I don't want to go into the technical details, but anything with a 13-point something reading level means it's college level and above, like a grade 13. So this is what you would expect kids to be able to read. We know from other sources, and I will only mention this briefly because this is what I cover in this article I've been writing, and that is most American students, when they graduate high school, are reading at a grade 6 level. It doesn't matter if the work has an adult subject matter, it's the vocabulary and sentence structure that is easy. And that's why kids have terrible problems at college, because they're being given multisyllabic words that come from the different disciplines, sociology, anthropology, whatever they're taking, and the sentence structure is complex or long. So if they've only read something like Grapes of Wrath or Steinbeck's, some of Steinbeck's other work, particularly Hemingway's work. Hemingway, as you know, wrote monosyllables. I mean, that was his style. The subject matter is adult, but the vocabulary is easy. That's how English teachers have been coping for a couple of decades in trying to keep these readers moving along or interested in school. The problem is that it doesn't prepare them for college level reading, because there's a huge gap between a college level science textbook, and if you even look at an older high school level science textbook, you will know that the number of hard words in a paragraph is staggering. Would be for me, if I'm not in the field where you're reading, and math would be the same way if you have a lot of the terminology in math. If it's introduced gradually over the years, you learn a little bit of it, and if you've been in science courses where you're being introduced, you know, what's the composition of the molecule, the atom, the things that are in the atom, if you're learning this vocabulary gradually over the years, by the time you're in high school, so you've mastered some of that vocabulary, and it isn't going to hit you like cold towel when you go to college, and suddenly you're being hit with all of these words that you never saw before. Even if the paragraphs are short, the density of science material, and this is for STEM, this is the problem with science, technology, engineering, and math, what we call the STEM areas, where you have, for engineering or science in particular, dense material with a lot of multisyllabic vocabulary that you've got to just understand right away in order to understand the paragraph. So here we have a focus in the ELA program in Common Core on snippets that are not attached very closely to reading levels, because the material is too short to have any consistent higher level reading score attached to it. This was not the case, I will mention, and I've put that at the very end of that little clause, a phrase. The older standards emphasized literary texts for the most part. Why did they do that? Not because English teachers wanted to punish kids to get them to read literature. It was because literary texts are the way in which historically kids have been led from grade to grade to get up to grade 12. They have plots. Science doesn't have a plot. History doesn't have that kind of a plot over a long period of time. And if you've ever read a hard book, if you remember as a child reading like Kidnapped, Treasure Island, when you were young and you were reading a book that had hard vocabulary, Robert Louis Stevenson used a very mature vocabulary, it was the plot that kept you going. A good reader didn't care about the words they didn't know. You just skipped over them, moved on. And it was the plot. This is why even students who can't read well like Frankenstein, because I had a student in a Boston school system years ago who introduced his grade 9 students who did not like Their Eyes Were Watching God, if you know that particular word, because of the dialect. And they didn't like the plot. as well as the dialect, which they didn't understand because it wasn't their dialect. So he gave them Frankenstein. They didn't understand half the words in every chapter. If you know Frankenstein, it's at a grade 12 level, and it was written by Mary Shelley with a very difficult vocabulary. He gave them some vocabulary help, but they loved the story. It was fascinating. So it kept them going from chapter to chapter to find out what happened to Frankenstein. Who was Frankenstein? It got them to learn a lot of vocabulary they never would have learned otherwise, but the point was that it was the plot that kept them going, because they could learn enough by what they could read and with the teacher's help and vocabulary every week. The point being that teachers in the pre-Common Core standards wanted a literary thrust because that was how they could get kids not only to move up the ladder in terms of the literate vocabulary, not technical, but literate vocabulary in what they assigned them, but also it was of help to kids in learning how to read between the lines. And if you've ever seen English teachers at a workshop, it's almost funny. It's like the stereotype that you see. But I watched a group of 80 teachers who were asked by the professor in charge of this NCTE workshop to do something with Wordsworth's poem. My heart leaped up when I saw, a rainbow in the sky. There's a famous poem that begins, my heart leaped up when I saw a rainbow in the sky. I may not have that quite right. It's a very short poem. But one of the lines, and most of it's monosyllables, as you can hear, it seems simple, but one of the lines is, and the child is father to the man. That's Wordsworth. So this literary scholar said, how would you have your students in high school interpret that line? Well, that got those teachers going for an hour. They loved it. That was their question. They all had different ways they helped their kids to learn how to interpret the child as father to the man. There's no answer to the question. The question is an interpretive one. And the question is, how do you get kids to go into the text, read between the lines, and figure out where there's evidence for whatever interpretation they want to bring up? And this is what these English teachers were sharing. So this is the development of analytical reading. You're learning to go in between the lines. Where do you go? It doesn't happen with science texts or history textbooks, because the purpose of those textbooks is to teach you the information that's in them. They're not literary, they're not elliptical in nature. They're not trying to be elusive, they're not trying to be in any way subtle. They want you to understand whatever the topic is. That's the nature of a well-written science or history textbook. But literary works don't function that way. So when English teachers have you focus on Hamlet's to be or not to be, it's monosyllables. What's wrong with it? You don't understand to be or not to be? Well, there's a profound thought there. And you've got to sort of go back and forth to go through that whole soliloquy to come up with what you think is an interpretation of what is meant at that point by Shakespeare, the character of Hamlet, and so forth. So the older standards had more of a focus on literature because that was what our teachers wanted. It wasn't me. This is what English teachers said they wanted. And B, as a result, they spent more time on reading than writing. Common Core has done the opposite. For reasons I still don't understand, it spends more time on writing. And as someone who studied reading, research, because that was my area in graduate school, we know that for 100 years, reading precedes writing. That good writers have been good readers, that if you want to do anything well in school, you have to know how to read well. That writing piggybacks off of reading, not the other way around. So why spend more time on writing when you absorb the structure of a good English sentence by reading lots of good English sentences? You understand the vocabulary you might want to use in writing better if you've seen it in what you've read, because then you see it with its various nuances, or at least you have a better sense of what the words mean. But this is what Common Core does, particularly in the early grades. Kids spend a lot of time on writing, far more than they can handle. When I began to see the writing prompts on the practice tests that asked third graders to write an essay, and I thought, what third grader knows what an essay is? Essays used to be taught starting in grade 8 or 9, never complete because you never finish learning how to write a good essay. But you don't start in grade 3 because kids can't conceptualize the structure of an essay. Most of them can't. Anyway, C. It goes with what I was talking about initially. Common Core focuses on skills, not academic content knowledge. Why does that matter? It matters because of what we know from psychologists and people who've looked at good reading as opposed to poor reading, that you need to know a lot about a subject before you can do critical thinking about it. You can't think critically about anything with an intellectual vacuum in your head.